The most frightening houses are not the abandoned ones, not the ones with broken windows, dead lawns, or warning signs nailed crookedly to the door. Sometimes, the most frightening house is the one with bikes in the garage, tiny shoes by the entryway, children's artwork taped to the wall, and a family calendar filled with doctor's appointments, preschool events, grocery runs, and reminders to pick up takeout. Sometimes terror doesn't arrive wearing a mask. Sometimes it wears pajamas. Sometimes it whispers from inside the mind. And sometimes, by the time anyone realizes something is wrong, the house has already gone silent. On January 24, 2023, in Duxbury, Massachusetts, a quiet coastal town about 35 miles south of Boston, the Clancy family home looked like any other family home at the end of a winter day. It was the kind of place where people moved for peace, for safety, for a good life. The kind of town where neighbors recognized strollers, school buses, and the rhythms of young families trying to survive the chaos of raising children. Inside that home lived Patrick Clancy, his wife Lindsay, and their 3 children. Cora was 5, Dawson was 3, Callan was only 8 months old. 3 small children, 3 little lives, 3 bedtime routines, 3 sets of toys, 3 voices that should have filled that home for years. But by the end of that night, all 3 would be at the center of one of the most disturbing true crime cases Massachusetts had seen in years. And the question that still haunts the case is not just what happened, it is how. How does a mother described by many as loving, attentive, and deeply devoted end up accused of the unthinkable? How does a home full of children become a crime scene? How does a husband leave for what should have been a quick errand and return to a nightmare no person could ever prepare for? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, was there a moment when this could have been stopped? Every case we cover takes hours of research and fact-checking, because these were real people, not just headlines. If you value respectful, detailed true crime content, hit like and subscribe so this case can reach more people. And before we continue, comment where you're watching from. We always like seeing how far this community reaches. Before the headlines, before the court documents, before the public arguments over postpartum mental illness, medication, responsibility, and guilt, there was a family that appeared from the outside to be normal, painfully normal. That is part of what makes this case so difficult to look away from. There was no dark alley, no stranger in the shadows, no missing person poster, no long police chase, no hidden basement, just a young family, a mother, a father, 3 children. A house on a residential street. And then, in one evening, everything collapsed. Lindsay Clancy was a labor and delivery nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital, a profession built around the beginning of life. She helped mothers. She cared for babies. She worked in the very world where families are formed, where newborns take their first breaths, where parents cry from joy and exhaustion. People who knew her described her as caring, capable, and gentle. She was not someone who, from the outside, seemed destined for a courtroom. She was not someone people expected to see in a mugshot headline. She was a mother who posted about her children, a woman who appeared to love her family, a nurse who understood babies, birth, recovery, and the fragile months after delivery. But behind the front-facing version of life, there was something else, something darker, something that, according to court records and statements later made by attorneys, had been growing in the months after the birth of her youngest child, Callan. Lindsay had reportedly been struggling with postpartum mental health issues. The words used in connection with the case would become widely debated: postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, postpartum psychosis. Her defense would later argue that she was suffering from a severe mental health crisis at the time of the killings. Prosecutors would argue the acts were deliberate and planned. And between those two positions lies the cold, terrifying center of this case, because mental illness can be invisible. It can sit across from you at breakfast. It can answer texts. It can smile for photos. It can sound calm on the phone. And inside, the person may be fighting something no one else can see. Lindsay had reportedly been prescribed multiple medications in the month leading up to the tragedy. Her mental state had become a point of concern. There were claims she had experienced thoughts of self-harm. There were medical appointments. There were efforts to seek help. But help in cases like this is never as simple as people want it to be after the fact. Afterward, everyone asks why no one did more. Why didn't someone see it? Why wasn't she hospitalized longer? Why was she alone with the children? Why did Patrick leave the house? Why didn't she say the one thing that would have made everyone stop? But the horrifying truth is that most disasters do not announce themselves clearly. They arrive disguised as improvement, as a better day, as a normal conversation. As a mother telling her husband she needs something from the store. On the day of the tragedy, according to prosecutors, Lindsay and Patrick had been communicating normally. There were errands, dinner, medication, the ordinary logistics of family life. Nothing about that sentence sounds like the beginning of a murder case. That's what makes it so chilling. The day did not begin with screaming. It did not begin with police lights. It began with the machinery of a young family running on routine. Patrick was reportedly working from home that day. Lindsay was home too. The children were there. A winter day, a household in motion. Anyone who has ever lived with small children knows the kind of exhaustion that fills a home like that. Snacks, naps, diapers, questions, crying, laughter, laundry, tiny feet running room to room. The relentless, beautiful, crushing noise of early parenthood. But somewhere under that noise, prosecutors would later suggest Lindsay was forming a plan. Her defense would say something very different, that she was not in her right mind, that she was driven by mental illness, that what happened was not the work of a rational person making rational choices. And that is where the case becomes almost impossible to process, because the actions were real, the children were real, the deaths were real, but the mind behind those actions remains the battlefield. Later, authorities would describe a timeline so ordinary at first that it almost feels unbearable. Lindsay allegedly searched for information about a restaurant. She reportedly asked Patrick to pick up food. She also asked him to stop at CVS. Simple requests, normal requests, husband and wife requests. The kind of thing that happens in millions of homes every night. Can you grab dinner? Can you pick something up? Can you run to the pharmacy? But in this case, prosecutors would later argue that those errands were not random. They believe Lindsay sent Patrick away. And that detail is one of the reasons this case has captured so much attention. Because if true, it means the nightmare had a countdown. It means the clock started ticking the moment Patrick walked out the door. Imagine that for a second. A father leaves his home, likely thinking about nothing more sinister than traffic, food, maybe getting back before the kids melted down for the night. He leaves behind his wife and children, believing they are safe, believing he is coming back to the same home he just exited. He has no idea that every minute he is gone will later be examined like evidence from a black box after a crash. The route, the time stamps, the calls, the texts, the receipt, the distance, the return. Every ordinary movement becomes horrifying in retrospect, because while Patrick was out, something happened inside that house, something no one wants to imagine, something that would leave investigators, first responders, and eventually the entire country stunned. Authorities allege that Lindsay Clancy strangled her 3 children, Cora, Dawson, Callan. The alleged method itself is horrific enough that it does not need embellishment. No detail can make it more tragic. No dramatic language can make it more real. 3 children who should have been protected inside their own home were instead found in a scene of devastation. And then Lindsay herself allegedly attempted to take her own life by jumping from a second-story window. When Patrick returned home, he did not walk into an obvious crime scene at first. That is another chilling part of this story. He reportedly found Lindsay outside, injured after the apparent fall. His first horror may not even have been the full horror. At first, he may have thought his wife had hurt herself, that this was a medical emergency, that something terrible had happened to her. And then came the question no parent should ever have to ask. Where are the kids? According to reports, Patrick Clancy had returned home expecting dinner, a bag in his hand. maybe the cold still on his jacket, maybe the mental checklist of a father at the end of a long day. Get inside, put things down, check on the kids, settle the house, survive the evening routine. That is the cruelty of this case. There was no warning siren before the worst moment of his life. No shadow crossing the doorway. No sense that the air inside his own home had changed forever. When Patrick found Lindsay outside, injured after what authorities say was a jump from a second-story window, his world had already cracked open, but it had not yet fully collapsed. At first, the emergency was Lindsay, his wife, the mother of his children. She was alive, hurt, on the ground. And then came the question that turned injury into terror. Where are the kids? Those 5 words are the doorway into the darkest part of the Lindsay Clancy case. Because once Patrick asked, there was no going back. The house that had been a home minutes earlier became something else entirely, a place of searching, a place of dread, a place where silence suddenly had weight. Parents know the sound of children in a house. Even when they're quiet, there is usually something. A cartoon playing too low in the background. A toy dropping, a cough, a little voice calling from another room, a crib shifting. But on that night the silence was wrong, and Patrick, according to reports, went looking. What he found in the basement would become the center of a case that shocked the country. Cora, 5 years old, Dawson, 3 years old, Callan, 8 months old. All 3 children had been attacked. Cora and Dawson would be pronounced dead that night. Baby Callan was rushed to the hospital, still alive, still fighting, while paramedics and doctors did everything humanly possible to save him. For a brief moment, amid a horror no one could undo, there was one thin thread of hope. Maybe the baby could survive. Maybe one child could be pulled back from the edge. Maybe something could be saved from the wreckage. But days later, Callan died too. And with that, the Clancy family tragedy became complete in the most devastating way imaginable. 3 children gone, a father left behind, a mother accused of killing them, and a community left staring at a question so disturbing that it almost feels unsafe to say out loud. How does a mother do this? That question spread faster than any police report. It moved through Duxbury first, then Massachusetts, then the entire country. People who had never heard the name Lindsay Clancy suddenly knew it. People who had never stepped foot in that quiet town were reading every update, every statement, every courtroom detail. Some people reacted with rage. Some reacted with grief. Some reacted with fear. And others reacted with a kind of terrified recognition. Not because they could imagine harming their children, but because they understood something about the abyss of postpartum mental illness. They knew how quickly the mind can turn against itself, how terrifying intrusive thoughts can be, how isolation, sleep deprivation, medication changes, anxiety, depression, and hormonal chaos can twist reality into something unrecognizable. But for many, sympathy had a hard limit. Because 3 children were dead, and the legal system was now forced to face a question that medicine, morality, and the public rarely agree on. When does illness explain an act? And when does it not excuse it? Lindsay survived, but she did not walk away from that night unchanged. She suffered serious injuries from the fall, including paralysis, according to her attorney. From a hospital bed, she entered the next phase of the nightmare. Not as a grieving mother in the usual sense, but as the defendant in a triple child murder case. She was charged in connection with the deaths of her children. She pleaded not guilty. And almost immediately, 2 versions of Lindsay Clancy began to form in the public eye. One version was the devoted mother, the labor and delivery nurse, the woman who had cared for newborns and supported families. The woman whose friends and colleagues could not reconcile the person they knew with the allegations in the news. The woman who, according to her defense, had been suffering severely after childbirth, had been prescribed several medications, and was not mentally responsible in the way people assume when they think of murder. The other version was the calculated killer prosecutors described. A woman who, they argued, had the presence of mind to send her husband away, to time the window in which she was alone, and to carry out deliberate acts against her children. To prosecutors, this was not a sudden, uncontrolled blur. It was a sequence, a plan, a choice, and that contrast is what makes this case so haunting, because the evidence can feel like it points in two directions at once. The errands appear chilling. The timing feels chilling. The children's vulnerability is unbearable, but the psychiatric history is also chilling. The reported distress, the medication changes, the earlier treatment, the possibility that reality itself had become warped. It is one thing to say a person was depressed. It is another to say they may have been psychotic. Postpartum psychosis is rare, but when it appears, it can be catastrophic. It can involve delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, disorganized thinking, and a terrifying break from reality. It is not the same as ordinary sadness. It is not simply being overwhelmed. It is not just having a bad day. It is the mind becoming a locked room, and the person inside may not know where the exits are. But here is the part that chills people even more. From the outside, someone in crisis may still appear functional. They may send texts. They may make plans. They may speak calmly. They may ask for dinner. They may look like they are choosing. That is why cases involving mental illness and violence become so difficult. We want madness to look obvious. We want evil to look obvious. We want warning signs to be bright red, unmistakable, impossible to miss. But sometimes the warning signs are scattered like ashes. A comment here, a medication change there, an appointment, a fear, a strange thought dismissed as stress, a spouse trying to help but not knowing the cliff is closer than it looks, a doctor seeing one piece of the picture, a family seeing another, and then suddenly everyone is standing in the aftermath trying to assemble a puzzle that should have been solved before anyone died. In court, the arguments would begin to take shape. The prosecution focused on alleged planning. They pointed to the timeline. They described Patrick being sent out of the house. They argued that Lindsay knew what she was doing. The defense focused on her mental state. They argued that she was over-medicated, struggling, and in the grip of severe postpartum mental illness. Her attorney suggested she had been suffering from thoughts and symptoms that should have been recognized as dangerous. The defense framed the tragedy not as an act of cold-blooded murder, but as the result of a psychiatric collapse. And then there was Patrick, the father who had lost everything. In many true crime cases, surviving family members become voices of anger, demanding punishment, speaking with the fire of grief. And no one would have been surprised if Patrick Clancy had done exactly that. But his response stunned many people. He released a statement filled not with vengeance, but with grief, love, and a kind of mercy that was almost impossible to comprehend from the outside. He spoke about his children, their personalities, their beauty, their innocence. Cora's contagious laugh, Dawson's kindness, Callan's sweetness. He described them not as victims in a headline, but as living, breathing children who had filled his world. And then he wrote about Lindsay. He asked people to forgive her, not forget, not dismiss, not minimize, forgive. That single request shook people. Some admired it, some could not understand it, some rejected it completely. But it revealed something deeply human about the case. Patrick was not seeing a symbol or a headline or a monster in a comment section. He was seeing the woman he married, the mother of his children, the person who, in his words, had loved them intensely. And that is where the case becomes almost unbearable, because grief is not clean. It does not follow the rules people demand from a distance. Patrick could love his children and mourn them completely. He could be horrified by what happened. He could also believe that the woman responsible was sick. Those truths can coexist, even if they tear the heart apart. Meanwhile, the public conversation became brutal. Online, people split into camps. One side argued that Lindsay Clancy was being treated with sympathy because she was a white, middle-class mother, a nurse, someone who fit society's image of respectability. They asked whether the response would be the same if she were poor, black, addicted, undocumented, or already labeled a bad mother. It was a hard question and not an unfair one. Another side argued that postpartum mental illness is dangerously misunderstood, and that demonizing Lindsay without understanding her psychiatric condition could make other mothers more afraid to seek help. They warned that mothers in crisis often hide symptoms because they fear judgment, losing their children, or being treated like criminals before they are treated like patients. Both sides were really circling the same horror. A mother can be dangerous, a mother can be sick. A mother can be loving, a mother can kill, and the human mind does not always fit into the categories we need in order to feel safe. That is the fear at the center of the Lindsay Clancy case. Not just that 3 children died, but that the danger may have come from a place everyone is taught to trust most, a mother's arms. There is a primal terror in that, a violation of the deepest promise we believe exists in the world, that parents protect their children, that home is safe. That the person who tucks a child into bed will not become the person who ends their life. When that promise breaks, people look for reasons, a diagnosis, a demon, a medication, a plan, a failure in the system, a single explanation that can lock the horror away and make the rest of us feel protected. But this case refuses to be locked away easily. If you say it was only evil, you may ignore the warning signs of severe mental illness. If you say it was only illness, you may feel like the children's deaths are being softened into a medical event. If you say the system failed, you still have to ask which system, which moment, which person, and what could actually have been done. If you say Patrick should have known, you are placing hindsight on a grieving father who left his house for minutes and came back to devastation. If you say doctors should have known, you must confront how imperfect psychiatric prediction can be, especially when patients appear lucid, loving, and afraid of what will happen if they admit the darkest thoughts out loud. And if you say Lindsay should have stopped herself, you are standing directly in the center of the legal question still surrounding the case. Could she? That question is not emotional. It is not internet debate. It is the question courts must examine through evidence, experts, intent, capacity, and law. As of the latest public status, Lindsay Clancy has pleaded not guilty, and the legal process has been focused on determining criminal responsibility, mental state, and the facts of that night. The courtroom will not bring Cora, Dawson, or Callan back. It cannot restore Patrick's family. It cannot turn the house back into what it was before January 24th. All it can do is attempt to name what happened. Murder, insanity, responsibility, illness, justice. Words trying to cover a wound too large for language. And yet beyond the legal case there is another lesson here, one quieter but just as urgent. Postpartum mental illness can become an emergency, not a personality flaw, not weakness, not bad motherhood, an emergency. When a new mother says she is afraid of her thoughts, believe her. When she says she does not feel like herself, listen closely. When she cannot sleep for days, when she seems detached, paranoid, unusually agitated, obsessed with harm, convinced something is wrong with the baby, or terrified that she might do something terrible, do not leave her alone and hope it passes. Do not treat it as drama. Do not assume love is enough to stop a brain in crisis. Love is powerful, but it is not a locked door. And sometimes the most dangerous sentence in a family is, "She would never do that," because maybe she never would until she is not herself. Still, none of that erases the children. It cannot. Cora, Dawson, and Callan cannot become footnotes in a debate about medicine or law. They were not symbols. They were not case studies. They were children. Cora should have had birthdays and school pictures and scraped knees and whispered secrets. Dawson should have had muddy shoes, favorite dinosaurs, bedtime stories, and sleepy morning hair. Callan should have had first steps, first words, tiny teeth coming in, and a whole life no one had the right to take. Their names are the weight of this story. Everything else, the arguments, the hearings, the headlines, spins around that absence. A house in Duxbury went quiet that night, and the silence has never really ended. It lingers in every unanswered question. It lingers in the image of a father coming home, not knowing the life he had left behind minutes earlier no longer existed. It lingers in the contradiction of a nurse trained to help bring babies into the world now accused of taking her own children out of it. It lingers in the fear that danger does not always look like danger. Sometimes it looks like exhaustion. Sometimes it looks like depression. Sometimes it looks like a mother saying she just needs help. Sometimes it looks like a normal evening, a quick errand, a dinner pickup, a pharmacy stop, and then the door opens and everything is gone. The case of Lindsay Clancy is not frightening because it happened in darkness. It is frightening because it happened in the middle of ordinary life, because the house looked safe, because the family looked loving, because help had been sought, because people were nearby, because the children were home, because Patrick came back, just not soon enough. And that is the part that stays with you after the story ends. Not a scream, not a chase, not a masked stranger. Just the terrible thought that, somewhere, in a warm and familiar house, the person everyone trusts most may be fighting a battle no one can see. And if no one hears the warning in time, the silence that follows can last forever.